Chair Strickland, we are ready to go, and we've started the webcast, so whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Ad Hoc Community Benefits Procurement Committee. Unfortunately, I'm having some technical problems with my laptop, but thankfully I have my backup with my trusty phone here. So eventually my laptop will catch up, and I'll transfer from my phone onto my laptop. So we are having this meeting electronically due to keeping social distancing and practicing good public health measures during the pandemic. I know as Chair Redmond is here, but I believe the rest of the members of the committee are calling in from home or work. Before I kick things off, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather virtually today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and neutral people. We acknowledge the enduring presence of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today, their achievements and their contributions to our community. We have a very fulsome agenda today. I'm really pleased to see that so many people come and join us and share with us their wisdom and knowledge on community benefits. A couple of folks from Metrolinx couldn't make it, but we do have good solid representation from a variety of stakeholders and subject matter experts on community benefits, and we thank them very much in advance for attending. So to get things started, I'd ask the clerk to do an official roll call, please.
Thank you, Chair Strickland. We'll start with Regional Chair Redmond.
Present.
Councillor Galloway. Councillor Harris.
I'm present.
Councillor Jowett.
Present.
Councillor Kiefer.
Present.
Councillor Nowak. I'm not seeing Councillor Nowak here. And then Chair Strickland.
Yep, present.
So that's all present except
Great.
for Councillor Nowak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clerk. Any pecuniary interest? Anything to declare? Okay, seeing none. We need to approve minutes from the last meeting that were circulated with your agenda package last week. Any comments on the minutes? If not, we have a mover and seconder. Just speak up if you would, please. Moved by Chair Redmond, seconded by?
I will, Harris.
Okay, Mike Harris.
Michael Harris.
Oh, Michael, apologies, Michael. All those in favor? All those in favor? Just say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much. Okay, so our first presentation is from Dina Graser, and Dina is currently Senior Advisor at the Institute of Municipal Finance and Governance, the Monk School of Global Affairs, University of Toronto. From 2010 to 14, she was the Director of Community and Stakeholder Relations at Metrolinx, where she headed Metrolinx's first Community Relations Division. It was in this role that she pioneered its community benefits framework for the $5 billion Eglinton Crosstown LRT project. Welcome, Dina.
Thank you, Councillor. Lovely to be here.
Great to see you.
Would you like me just to plunge on in?
Just plunge on in. Just get her going right away. Yeah, great.
Can I share my screen? Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Yes? Okay. So I've been asked today to give a bit of an overview of community benefits, a bit of a 101 as it were. And I know you have a lot of speakers on the agenda today, so I'm going to move fairly quickly through this material. I see a lot of my esteemed colleagues in the community benefits space are also on this call, and some of them have, I would say, probably deeper current hands-on experience to share with you. This is a bit broader of an overview. And so to my colleagues who've seen some of this material before, I apologize and thank you for your patience, but I hope that it will be of some use to those of you who are a little less familiar with the subject matter. So here's what we'll review over approximately the next half hour. I'll talk about what community benefits are, what's going on in the country and in the province, give you a couple of examples, and then I'm going to talk about kind of the pros and cons, right? What is the value proposition, and why do people, particularly in Canada, particularly governments, why are they interested in community benefits? And then I was also asked to address some of the current critiques and challenges of implementing community benefits, and then a bit of a conclusion. So what are we talking about when we talk about community benefits? And it's a bit of a confusing term in Ontario, especially with recent changes to the Planning Act, because it gets mixed up an awful lot with what used to be considered sort of Section 37 benefits. But the way that we're defining it for the purpose of this presentation is additional physical, social, economic, or environmental benefits for the local community that are leveraged by dollars already being spent, generally on big infrastructure and development projects, but also could be on goods and services. So then, I mean, anytime you build a piece of public infrastructure, for example, there's going to be a community benefit by virtue of the fact that you've got the infrastructure. But this is looking at what other incremental benefits can be driven by spending more intentionally while you're already spending those dollars. Typically, when people talk about community benefits, they're talking about jobs, training, and apprenticeships for particular groups that they want to address. Sometimes it's opportunities for smaller local businesses or social enterprises or diverse suppliers, but it can include a whole range of things: affordable housing, environmental initiatives. The key here is that they're identified by the local community. And I always say, like, it's really easy, particularly as a government, to come up with a workforce strategy or a social, procurement strategy that is very targeted, but never involves talking to the community, and the whole point of community benefits really is that you should start with the place and work with your community to understand what those needs and aspirations are. In the States, I've seen community benefit deals that include everything from broadband access to community gardens to interest-free loans to local nonprofits. It really should be a reflection of what it is that the local community is looking for. Now, you're going to see a lot of different language used around this space, and in some ways they show different roads to the same place. So on the left, you have a diagram for a traditional community benefits agreement, right? You have the city, you have a developer, and then you usually have a coalition of community groups. These are private contractual agreements, and generally speaking, they are bottom up. They tend to be driven by the community, as opposed to what we might call social procurement, or in the UK, they call them community benefits clauses, which tend to be a bit more top-down and government-led. So let me spend just a minute longer pulling the threads on this. Because in Canada, we are, as is so often the case, creating a bit of a hybrid approach here. So community benefits agreements in the United States really grew out of mega projects, big projects. Like any of you who are NBA fans, as I am, may have watched games over the last year or two at the Staples Center in LA. And that was the site of one of the very first big community benefits agreements. It was a huge deal. And there was a coalition of community organizations that came together to negotiate a range of benefits out of that deal. But they are quite commonly used in the States now. And usually what you have is a group of community organizations who negotiate with a developer. And then the city sometimes is a signatory, sometimes it's an appendage to a development agreement, or sometimes they're just in there as a kind of go-between. But the key here, the thing that makes it different, is that it is a private contractual agreement with contractual provisions and remedies as well. Why would a developer bother? Well, for the developer, a lot of the times this is risk management, right? They get to address any community concerns up front. They build political buy-in sometimes that helps to expedite a regulatory process. In the States, when they've got these big agreements, they tend to do settlement agreements with the community coalitions to forestall litigation. And any of you who have ever been through an OMB process can appreciate the benefits of saving time and process. And it also reinforces their brand as a good corporate citizen. So that's the model commonly seen in the US. In the UK, what we've seen are the use of community benefits clauses or social procurement. And that's usually done through either policy or through the public procurement process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but why do governments do this there? They see it as a bit of a policy powerhouse. They can meet a range of objectives by effectively requiring bidders on public infrastructure or development projects to address particular objectives that they want to reach, whether that's supplier diversity or economic growth or workforce planning. Ultimately, for a government, they see it as maximizing the values of the dollars that they're already spending to try and broaden the range of benefits that they're getting out of a particular spend. So here in Canada, it's newer. The Vancouver Olympic Village was really the very first community benefits agreement that was done as a development agreement with the city and a community organization that was formed to represent the community in that case. We had Regent Park, which used what I would call community benefits clauses. But really, it's only the last number of years that we have started to catch up. And what we are seeing is community benefits frameworks or social procurement policies, which are now coming into force at all levels of government. And I think that the speakers today will probably talk about some of the lessons that have been learned along the way as we start to implement this. I'm not going to go through this whole list, but this gives you a sense of the breadth of what across the country, where we've got the federal government and 5 provinces who have already changed policies, practices, and legislation to incorporate greater social and economic goals into their procurement practices. And you can see it goes by all kinds of different names, but it's all really aimed at the same idea. On the municipal level, we've got social procurement and or community benefits frameworks in effect in Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, Victoria, with Buffalo. There's a whole coastal communities initiative in Vancouver Island with, I think, something like 26 communities. And then there are a number of regions and cities like Waterloo, which are exploring this and have various processes underway to investigate it. So let me give you a few examples. I used to use, I will say that in the early days of the work that I used to do on this, around 2014, 2015, I used all UK and US examples because there weren't that many in Canada. And now I'm happy to say I can use Canadian examples. So I'll just give you 3. Casino Woodbine is a more traditional community benefits agreement, possibly the only one so far in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And I'm going to let Denise, Andrea, Campbell, who I know is here, talk in more detail about it. But it was part of the development agreement, and it included a whole range of conditions, including local and social hiring, local and social procurement. There's a community use of space and procedures. There's a childcare center. I think Rosemarie Powell is also on the line, so she can give you some background about how a lot of this was negotiated. And that project is well underway, and you can see some of the numbers there in the yellow box. It is happening. The Park Casino in Vancouver was similarly a casino expansion project. I think you've got Kim coming from Vancouver, so she can talk a little bit more about that too. Again, it was a condition attached to the development agreement for a rezoning of the original casino site. Now, in that case, Ellis Dawn, which was the contractors, entered into partnerships with very specific community agencies and partners to achieve success. And again, you see the results there. I think the total inner city employment target, because they were really looking at trying to employ people who lived in the inner city, and I think the downtown east side in particular in Vancouver, that came to something like 1,817 work months, if I'm not mistaken. And then the procurement spend came to about 62 million. I will say in terms of the local procurement, they did have to go back at one point and renegotiate the definition of the local area in order to make those procurement targets work. And that's the kind of give and take that you often find in agreements of this sort. Of course, I'm deeply familiar with the Metrolinx LRT projects because I was there when the then fledgling Toronto Community Benefits Network knocked on my door and said, we want a community benefits agreement for the crosstown. And I said, what's that? But I will say that we had just come out of a process where we had created an investment strategy for Metrolinx with a number of recommendations to the provincial government in 2013 about how we were going to raise $40 billion for transit. And among those recommendations was one that came out of my office that said local communities should benefit from infrastructure being built in their neighborhoods through things like local hiring and local procurement. So although the term community benefits agreement was new to me, the concept was not. And as the director of community and stakeholder relations, it just made ultimate good sense to me that if we were going to be spending billions of dollars, we should try and maximize the policy objectives that the Ontario government could drive out of that spend. So we created this community benefits framework, we called it, to apply to all of the Metrolinx rapid transit projects, starting with the crosstown, with the goal of trying to maximize opportunities for training and employment and procurement in areas where that infrastructure was being built. And we did it by way of the procurement process, which is to say clauses were put into the RFPs that required bidders to provide a community benefits plan, including a 10% goal of targeted hiring. And that in itself is a whole story, which I'm happy to talk more about if you have questions later. But it was originally set, and still is in some ways, as an aspirational goal. But that wasn't very clear the first time around, which resulted in some bumps along the way. And I think that's one of the reasons why when you look at these results to date, you see the crosstown, which started in 2015, I think, with 202 hires and 222. PAT stands for professional, administrative, and technical positions. And then you see Finch, which started in 2019, and Huron, Ontario, which started this year. And you see how much higher those numbers are relative to the time period. And that, I think, is largely due to lessons learned on the crosstown, one of which, for examples, is you got to bring your subcontractors on at the beginning and make them also responsible for helping you incorporate and meet goals, which was, I think, something that that Crosslinks didn't do at the beginning. And so it took them a little while longer to ramp up. There's a bunch more lessons learned that I'm sure Rosemarie and Denise and others can talk to, but that's certainly one of the reasons that I think we see the numbers on these projects. As we learn, as we get more used to doing this in this region, it starts to get easier. People start to figure it out. But this is a bit of a public procurement model. There's a bunch of other projects going on in Ontario. In 2015, together with the long-term infrastructure plan brought in by the province, they also announced 4 pilot projects through Infrastructure Ontario. Finch Ellerty was one of them, the West Park Healthcare Centre, the renovation of the McDonald Block at the Ontario Legislature, and then I know they've just awarded the Thunder Bay Correctional Complex. Those projects were also intended to have community benefits provisions, and I'm hoping that Rosemarie Powell can speak to that because I haven't got the current numbers on those projects. York University is doing a campus expansion in Markham. They're using it. The Gordie Howe Bridge in Windsor, of course, is a federal project, big community benefits package there, which spans both sides of the border, which is really interesting. And then the Le Breton Flats National Capital Coalition in the city of Ottawa, they're also looking at attaching community benefits provisions, or taking what I would call more broadly a community benefits approach to some of the redevelopment there. Anchor TO is a community of practice in Toronto. It has 18 big public institutions that went on a learning journey that started a few years ago, which I think is also supported out of Denise, Andrea, Campbell, and April Lim's office, and they can speak to that about how to incorporate social procurement as well. So that gives you a little bit of a broad overview of what's going on in the region. There's a lot of interest in community benefits as a tool for more equitable and social economic development, generally speaking. And I will just step back for a moment and say that even though I've talked about these 2 models, you know, the freestanding agreements and the public procurement, I think one of the things that's caught on is the notion of using a community benefits approach writ large to planning. I mean, in an ideal world, if you take it right back to the source, anytime you do neighborhood planning, you should be thinking about all of these kinds of benefits at the same time. In an ideal world, you'd never have to have a community benefits agreement at the end of the project because you would have been engaging with the community and building in those kinds of benefits from the very beginning. And there are some big projects that have tried to do that, and maybe we'll get there at some point. But right now, the tool is really through procurement and community benefits agreements. So let me talk about why so many governments and organizations in Canada are interested in community benefits, and then I'll take a look at some of the common critiques and the challenges that are faced in implementing. I'm just going to keep on going if that's all right. But if anybody wants to stop me at any point, just unmic yourself and interrupt because I can't see you all. That's okay.
Dina, we'll save the questions to the end. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Keep
Very
rolling.
good.
Thank you.
Keep rolling. Here I go. All right. So what's the value proposition on this stuff? Why do people bother? There are 4 reasons that I think generally people and governments in particular tend to use for using community benefits, right? It's about driving greater economic and social value for money, supporting more equitable economic development, providing a competitive advantage for funding from senior levels of government, and to promote collaboration across the region. And I'm going to take each of these briefly, one at a time. So one of the issues with community benefits, or not one of the issues, but I guess one of the questions that I frequently get is around the business case, right? Do we know if this works? And how do the costs of doing things like this compare to other more traditional approaches? And I will say that there are no large-scale studies yet in Canada, but there have been some studies done elsewhere. So Wales did a study of 35 projects that used community benefits. They found 85% of that contract value was reinvested in Wales and about £1.80 worth of benefit for each pound spent. Scotland did a study of 24 projects over 5 years and found that employment-related targets were exceeded. I did a project for York Region in 2018, 2019, and I did a big research piece, and we looked at a range of projects from across the US and the UK and Canada at that point. I was not able to find any publicly available studies that really evaluated the effectiveness of this tool against more standardized practices. But we did find in those projects that we looked at, generally speaking, targets were exceeded on hiring and on spending. So it seems to be working. But I think generally we need a little bit more data in Canada before we can do those large-scale studies. Supporting more equitable economic development is another reason that we use community benefits. And this has been particularly advanced in the workforce area, right? This is about trying to really support training and placement in jobs for people who need them most. And that's not just construction jobs. It's also professional, administrative, and technical positions. And I would also note it can also be positions that last long after the infrastructure is built. One of the things that I love about the Woodbine Casino project is that it's not just about the construction of the project, but there were also provisions in that agreement for local hiring for the operations of the casino. And those are longer term jobs, right? Once you get into the operations of a facility. So those are great jobs to remember too. We have an aging workforce, particularly in the construction sector, and there is, simply stated, an opportunity cost to leaving good talent on the table. You've got a lot of newcomers and internationally trained professionals who are coming from outside, or at least were until the pandemic, but I think will be again. It can be challenging, right, to recruit and retain workers. So people see this as a pathway, a very valid pathway, to try and ensure that people, particularly from historically disadvantaged and equity-seeking groups, get a crack at good, long-term, sustainable careers. It's also used for supply chain initiatives, right? By supporting innovation, by promoting entrepreneurships and opportunities for small and diverse businesses. I mean, Waterloo in particular is certainly known to have an innovation culture. So, that is certainly something you could think about bringing to your procurement process. And I think one of the great success stories here is the City of Toronto's supplier diversity policy. I won't speak to that because I suspect Denise will, but there's some great figures coming up. And the final thing that I would say about equitable economic development is that a lot of people these days are looking at community benefits and similar tools as ways to help emerge from the recovery, emerge from the pandemic as a recovery tactic coming out of the pandemic. Providing a competitive advantage for federal funding. You may know that the federal government a few years ago created the Community Benefits Employment Initiative, which requires the provinces, in the context of the bilateral infrastructure agreements, to report to the federal government on their employment and procurement. And there was recently $12 billion announced for transit in Toronto and Hamilton. And attached to that agreement were requirements that projects satisfy certain conditions, including, and I'm going to quote here, measures to maximize high quality jobs and benefits for communities, including through mechanisms such as community benefit agreements with hiring targets of at least 10% for historically disadvantaged communities, equity-seeking groups, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, with possible higher targets based on an assessment of local representation. So I think the notion that is, if you are competing for federal dollars, this is something the federal government is interested in, and I think many governments feel this will position them to be more competitive for those dollars. And then finally, the region already has, I'm sure, a number of efforts going on in workforce development and training and economic development, certainly in planning. And this is a way to build on those efforts that are already underway to encourage collaboration between key partners. And it also can offer an opportunity to try some demonstration projects to test approaches and ensure that it makes sense for you and figure out the best route forward. So those are the typical reasons that people like community benefits. There are some challenges and there are some critiques. So I want to go through each of those, and I'll speak to a little of each of these challenges and then how typically they get mitigated. And again, I'm sure that your speakers today will speak a little bit more about them in the context of some of the projects that they've been working on. Everybody says, what's it cost? Right? And I would say here, when we talk about costs, what we're really talking about is resources. And by resources, that might mean money, but it might just mean time, or it might mean effort, right? Depending on what you're doing. So there are really three areas in which this becomes relevant. There's cost to governments and procurers. There's the cost for the supports that might be needed to create a bit of a system around this. And then there's the cost to contractors. So what's it cost to government? Well, you're going to need resources because depending on what you do, there may be a need for internal education. You're going to need to communicate about what this is, both internally and externally. If you're doing community benefits on a development or infrastructure project in particular, you're going to need to do community outreach. And I like to hope that most governments are already engaging in community outreach when they do this kind of planning and development. So this shouldn't be a new thing, but it is something that has to be considered as part of it. And then there's tracking, monitoring, and enforcement, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. There are costs for the supports, which is really about trying to create what we call the workforce pipeline, which is the system of who comes together to help recruit and train and support and place workers. And that does require significant coordination. And then there's the question of, does it cost contractors anything? And what it might cost contractors is staff and time for implementation and tracking and monitoring. It's like I always say when I try to explain this to my mother, who's 84, I say to her, if you're going to hire 100 people to build a bridge, we're not asking you suddenly to hire 110. What we're asking you to do is to be more intentional about maybe 10% of those hires, so that you might hire 90 through the normal course and 10% are going to come through a particular program that works on this particular project. So from a cost perspective, it's not that you're adding more labor or you're adding particular costs, but that it does take a certain amount of time to get the system into place. So it does require time and effort and resources, particularly at the beginning, because you're implementing new systems and practices, right? And like any change management initiative, that's going to require some doing. One of the few studies I did find about this, the Glasgow Housing Authority, which has been using community benefits for over a decade, they had an external analysis done of 13 contracts to look particularly at the cost question. And it did demonstrate that the costs of their program were below national benchmark levels, and that the contractors who scored highest on the community benefits portion of the tenders were interestingly also among those who scored the highest in quality measures. So, yes, I think costs within government are not high, but changes will be needed within procurement departments. And the workforce pathway is going to be a fair piece of work. Contractors might have transaction costs if they want to unbundle subcontracts, for example, to ensure local suppliers can bid, and the tracking and monitoring piece as well. I get a lot of questions. This is just really complicated. Well, yeah, some of it is and some of it's not, right? So the procurement process, I don't think this should require a whole new methodology on the part of procurement process. I worked with York Region for a couple of years, as I said, and they have a new procurement bylaw which is coming into place. And really, I think for the region there, as here, the question is really clearly defining what you're trying to get out of it. What are the outcomes that you're trying to pursue, right? Once you've defined that, those get included as requirements. So if the outcomes you're trying to pursue, for example, is a certain target of workforce hires or a certain spend, then that goes into your RFP. In the same way that if you wanted, aluminum window frames or wooden window frames, it would be an output spec, right? Think of this as an output spec. So you need to be precise about what it is that you're putting in. You need to weight that criteria in the same way that you'd weight anything else that comes in a bid. And you should probably ask contractors about their experience delivering on this kind of thing and ensure that your bid evaluation team includes people with expertise in the areas being assessed. But the procurement process for this shouldn't really be any more complex than any others. Where you may need to change that process is on how you value the criteria. For example, do you add points for social value? There are certainly a bunch of other topics we can get into, like hard versus soft targets and so on and so forth. But the one thing that I will say to you is that I've worked with private contractors who are responding to bids on community benefits. And the one thing that they have said to me is, we're in the business of delivering. Tell us what we need to deliver, and that's what we'll give you. If you tell us something is a nice to have, if you tell me you'd rather have a wooden window frame than an aluminum one, we'll probably give you the aluminum one because it's cheaper. But if you tell us that the wooden frame is a must-have, that's what we'll deliver. And it's the same thing here, right? Be clear about what you want delivered and make that part of the RFP. The complexity, on the other hand, of workforce initiatives is, I think, a more valid concern because it takes a lot to people trained and supported through apprenticeships and jobs and things like that. And size matters and type matters, right? It probably doesn't make a lot of sense to have a workforce policy and a whole system set up if your average project cost is, $50,000 renovation of a community center. On the other hand, if it's a larger project, it may. It's also the type of project, right? If you're doing a road repaving and 90% of it is materials and only 10% is labor, then that also might not be the kind of project that makes sense for this sort of thing. So you have to really think about what the kind of project it is. In an ideal world, you'd create a sort of central portal and a hiring list to provide employers with access to job-ready candidates. But really what you need to do is create a table, because you're going to require the partnership and coordination of a whole bunch of different workforce agencies and unions, right? The Regent Park project is one of the first to use community benefits a long time ago, and it ran into trouble because it never talked to labor before it put all this into place. So it did a whole bunch of training of people in Regent Park and then discovered that the training that they'd given these candidates actually didn't match up to the labor needs. So you really need to have labor at the table. You need to have your workforce agencies at the table, so that you can come up with a coordinated strategy that makes sense. And that is time and resource intensive. And I think that both Rosemarie and Denise can talk to you with a lot more detail about how far we've come in the city of Toronto on trying to move that system forward. Similarly, with supply chain initiatives, if you don't already have lists of suppliers, that can be a labor-intensive exercise, but there's also ways to address that. You can work with certification and supplier councils. You can work with other key partners across the region, like local chambers of commerce, for example. And there are certain things that you can do around identifying contracts of a suitable scale, requiring only essential qualification criteria. There's a bunch of experience out there around how to create good supplier contracts. And that's an easier one to start small with and grow. And so that's the way that a lot of governments in particular have done this, is they started with sort of small pilot projects and then they've grown them from there. Tracking and monitoring comes up a lot, and it's really only complex because we haven't standardized to do it. In the States, they have specialized software. You see here a summary report from Los Angeles, for example, that shows you hours worked. I don't know if that's too small for you to see or not, but it's standardized in the States, not so much here. But reporting and tracking requirements should be part of the project agreement. It needs to be in the contract. It needs to be clear. Your definitions need to be clear. Who are the workers that you're targeting? How do you want them reported on? How are you going to assess process? How are you going to collect that data? Who and how is going to report? I know the City of Toronto has been working on this. I know Metrolinx has been working on this. All of the contractors on the Metrolinx projects have been working on this, right? It would make sense to me, stepping back from all of this, to implement a kind of common system across the province so that we could all report in similar ways. And that's the data geek in me that says, geez, it would be so great in 5 years to have good data that's comparable across all of these projects so that we can really measure our process. But right now, what we don't have all of that good comparable data. But everybody needs to figure out a way to do this. And I think the simplest way to do it is through payroll, which is what Los Angeles Metro does. So what's the best approach? People often ask me, and I think, it ultimately comes down to your own strategic plans and priorities as a region. But the studies that I have done, and I have spent a fair bit of time doing research on this, particularly in the early years here, some key lessons do emerge. So leadership is critical. And by leadership, I mean both political leadership at a government level and bureaucratic leadership. Because you need political will to move this forward, and you need somebody on the inside who is able to make things move at the bureaucratic level. You need to have clear policy basis and alignment with what you're trying to do, implementation strategies and guidelines. As I said before, you need to figure out who is it that you're trying to address, what are the needs, you need to define those clearly, and figure out what your KPIs, your targets are. This is really not something that can be done in isolation. This is a systemic approach, and it will need systemic solutions. And that calls for collaboration between key partners in the region, whether that's Employment Ontario or your own workforce agencies, labor, the city, community partners. All of those are needed at the table. The community needs to be with you, and they need to be involved from the beginning to figure out what those needs and aspirations are all the way through. Often community has a seat at a table that's designed to help monitor and enforce agreements. Monitoring and enforcing and evaluation, this should be put in the project agreement, and therefore it would have rights and remedies as with any contract. But in truth, the most successful community benefits projects tend to have monitoring committees made up of the owner and the procurer and the community who meet regularly to troubleshoot and accord a measure of flexibility, right? It's not about saying, oh, you said you'd use 4 construction apprentices over here and you only use 2, so suddenly we're going to invoke the penalty clauses. There has to be a certain amount of give and take on these projects. Oh, it turned out you only needed 2. Okay, can we reallocate those hours over here? Can we figure out a way to make these work? And certainly in all of the projects that I talked to in the States, that level of collaboration with the contractor and that level of flexibility and give and take is really key to making this work, especially as we are all just beginning to build and grow the system. But you do need to monitor it, you do need to enforce it, and you do need to evaluate it. And it will engage resources. There's no question about it. The region, for its part, can play a lot of roles, and you have to decide what role that's going to be. Are you going to act as the procurer? Are you going to act as the convener? Are you going to be a partner? Are you going to be an implementer? You might be all of those things. But that's part of the discussion that I think needs to happen at your own table. So as I say, we need good comparable data over a period of a number of years to really make a compelling business case for it and understand what the long-term outcomes are. But I would say to you that individual projects and cities are seeing success as partners come together to define and deliver on these benefits. And we need to keep working. We need to keep building the infrastructure. We need to keep sharing best practices. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is bring a culture of innovation to drive long-term systemic change. I always like to say community benefits is about building economies and changing lives. But that kind of big systemic change doesn't happen overnight. So you have to really be committed to moving it forward and understand that it's going to take some time to do it. And that's it for me. I hope that was helpful.
Well, that was very helpful, and thank you very much, Dina. That was a very comprehensive overview of community benefits agreements and pros and cons, so very much appreciated. And just for the benefit of the rest of the committee, we do have some time for questions, but we're scheduled to end at 10:30. And 4 more speakers, so let's ask a couple questions here and move on. We're mostly in listening and learning mode today. Councillor Galloway.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks very much, Dina, for that. That was really interesting for me, at least, because it's a relatively new topic. So that was a quick 101, as you said. Just one question then, although I could have a lot more. You cited the study in Wales that there was a 1 to 1.8 advantage, and I'm curious whether or not that was every project would have some community benefit, a local benefit, whether or not there was an agreement or not associated with it. So was that, if you know, was that the incremental increase due exclusively to the community or local benefit agreement, or was that just a measure of the leveraging that took place with those projects?
Yeah, I would have to go back and dig into the details, but as I recall, they did it through public procurement, and they had a workforce component and a local spending component, and they did a study that looked at the economic spin-offs, right, and the value that was accrued to it. So I think that I'm trying to remember because it's been a while since I read the study. I think that in particular, the local procurement piece was new. That was incremental because that hadn't been part of what they had done before. So from that, it was certainly new. I am not sure if the employment piece, because as I say, remember that it's not about increasing the amount of employment per se. It's about being more intentional about who you employ, right? So it's not clear to me that would have been different with or without community benefits provisions, but I think certainly the local spending was an incremental added value. I'd be happy to send you the study if you like. I'd have to go back and look it up to be more.
That's fine. I just thought maybe you'd know. Yeah. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay, great. Any other questions for Dina? I know just further to that, sometimes when they look at those studies, I don't know if it's part of the Glasgow study or not, but depending on who you hire, as Dina referred to, if the person, for example, is on a government income support program and you remove them from the government income support program and give them a job, now you're going from negative revenue to positive revenue, and that calculation is often included in the incremental benefit of having a community benefits program.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks very much, Dina. I really appreciate that. Great job.
No problem. Thank you.
All right.
Great. Should I hang out for a little bit in case there's more, or shall I say
you're welcome. You're welcome to hang out for as long as you like, but we won't be here past 10:30.
Well, I won't be here past 10, but I'll listen in because I'm always interested to hear my colleagues.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much. So our next speaker we're pleased to have with us is Denise Andrea Campbell, the Executive Director of Social Finance Development and Administration of the City of Toronto. Welcome, Denise.
Oh, good morning. Thank you so much for having us be part of your exploration today of community benefits, starting with Dina's excellent overview and context. My colleague April Lim is here joining, and she's going to really run the deck for us, but I just wanted to point her out because April really has, over the last few years, been digging deep into this work and really helping to drive it here at the city. Next slide, please. So given your time crunch, I'm going to try to motor through these slides and take you on a quick journey of the City of Toronto's journey on community benefits. As this slide illustrates, we have actually been working on community benefits for quite some time, but really since 2015, there's been a flurry of activity at the policy level in particular to really drive community benefits activity within the City of Toronto. At times, this fast pace of policy development has certainly created some challenges. So I'll highlight some of those, and they really align to what some of the challenges that Dina has already described. But just to sort of map out the last 6 years for you a little bit more specifically. So in 2015, Council adopted reduction strategy, and this really created a formal mandate for staff to develop a community benefits framework at the city. And then from that watershed 20-year plan, a number of back-to-back policies and initiatives have really, we've been able to deliver to advance inclusive economic development through community benefits related initiatives. So you'll see that our first one out was social procurement policy, but I just have to say that that took 10 years so from, 2006 to 2016, I was championing the development of social procurement policy at the city, and really in the last few years before that, working with our new head of procurement at the time, that led us to actually having a policy that council could adopt and that we could advance. Dina highlighted the Rexdale Community Benefits Agreement came in 2018. And then based on all of that work, we were able to put together the Community Benefits Framework in 2019 for council adoption. And then council further invested in that framework this past year through the budget. So inclusive economic development is really our goal in Toronto, and it is about proactive and intentional training, employment and business opportunities for communities that historically face systemic barriers and discrimination that often results in economic instability. Inclusive economic development is about intentionally addressing anti-Black racism and Indigenous reconciliation by designing policies and programs that ensure that Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities can access and prosper from the city's economic development initiatives through community benefits. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I will not go into detail on this slide, but it's meant just to add a little bit to Dina's points around some of the factors that have really resulted in the swell of public and political interest in community benefits in Toronto over the last number of years. So from community advocacy and public infrastructure spending to obviously a Build Back Better commitments for COVID recovery. Next slide, please. As you have likely experienced, and Dina touched on this a little bit as well, the term community benefits is often used interchangeably to mean many different things to different groups, which can cause confusion at times. So in Toronto, we understand community benefits processes to be how the corporation and the municipality of the City of Toronto can multiply the impact of our spending that delivers multiple benefits for residents. So when the city buys, builds, or provides financial incentives, it can do so with conditions that create community benefit opportunities. And these conditions can create economic opportunities to benefit Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities, such as employment, training, and business opportunities. The community benefits framework, so the policy that guides our work in Toronto, was developed over the course of a 12-month period between 2018 and 2019. It was developed through extensive literature review, jurisdictional scans, best practice research, key informant interviews with various community benefit leaders across North America, and in-depth community and stakeholder engagement in Toronto, as well as consultations with city divisions, city agencies, and corporations. Next slide, please. So what is the community benefits framework in Toronto exactly? So it is a policy and program framework for the city that provides coordination and guidance on community benefits practices and models for city divisions, agencies, and corporations on how to incorporate community benefit opportunities into city programs and initiatives. It includes guidance on how to implement coordinated systems approach to local and social hiring pathways, how to conduct consistent practices for monitoring and evaluating community benefit programs, and how to advance supplier diversity through social procurement goals. The framework aims to build capacity across city divisions, city agencies, and corporations to use City of Toronto contracts where there is legal authority to create conditions for employment, training, and business opportunities that reach Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities in Toronto. It is important that the community benefits framework aligns and intersects with other Toronto equity-seeking communities, equity strategies, the ones that's listed on the slide here. And our framework is very new at the City of Toronto, despite, 6 years doesn't seem, it sometimes can seem long and not long, not fast enough for communities, but this work is still in its early days, with much of the work to be to build a foundation that ensures community benefit outcomes are achievable and that programs are sustainable. And I think that's the key thing. And one of the key messages that was in Dina's presentation is really about the long-term nature of this work. So how do we build it fast? Given its critical and urgent nature for communities, but how do we do it in a way that is sustainable and actually can deliver impact over time? So the City of Toronto uses our contracts with divisions, agencies, and corporations to embed and secure community benefit clauses directly into contracts like procurements, legal agreements. Therefore, the city assumes the role of contract enforcer, and this includes setting targets that are hard and measurable, and monitoring and overseeing the implementation of community benefit clauses through those contracts. The Toronto approach to community benefits does not require third-party community signatory or tripart community benefits agreements. As Dina notes, we ensure as part of this that community informs the benefits being secured by the city, but the city is the signatory, and we must be able to act independently on contracts. Our Toronto approach lowers the risk of contract non-compliance, which ultimately ensures that community benefits gets delivered to communities. Next slide. So there seems to be a misconception that there is no community signatory to contracts that contain community benefit clauses, that if we don't have that, that means that transparency and accountability are compromised. At the city, we are feeling very strongly that that's not the case. So transparency and accountability, which are key to this work, I think meeting the promise for communities, are achieved through various oversight and public accountability structures and mechanisms, and then the different roles that community can play. This work isn't perfect, and we're still working on it with partners, and Rosemarie is so I'm sure she'll have much to say on this particular point. But it's critical for us as part of transparency and accountability that community participate in the community engagement and consultation at project design and planning stages of large-scale city projects. That once the community benefit clauses are embedded in contracts, that we are doing regular progress reporting on implementation so the community understands the progress of the work and how and when benefits will be secured. Similarly, report annually to council where there's opportunity as well for community engagement, and the Toronto Community Benefits Network has certainly used that mechanism as well to help drive some of the changes that they feel are important in this work. We've also established a Community Benefits Advisory, which is comprised of 50 plus members from city partners, community and stakeholder groups, and we also have some ad hoc working groups where advisory members can help problem solve and work collaboratively with Toronto City staff to develop the various detailed mechanisms and processes to make this work real. We also create space for community representatives in community benefit oversight committees. So the Rexdale Casino Woodbine Community Steering Committee, that membership includes 2 local residents, Toronto Community Benefits Network, Humber College, and United Way. This slide here lists some current community benefit initiatives that fall within our community benefits frameworks. In addition to these initiatives, there are at least 10 more that are in review and development across various city divisions. Several of the initiatives listed here are overseen by multiple city contracts that contain community benefits conditions, and the details are stated on the slide. We can certainly provide more details on any of these as we reported out to council progress, and all of these in our most recent City of Toronto Council report. Next slide, please. So the City of Toronto cannot drive community benefits alone. It is a systems change work that requires significant change management, I think, in every part of the system, inside city, but certainly beyond. The city sees itself as a systems player, a connector, and an innovator. The city cannot achieve systems changes without the collaboration with community partners and key stakeholders. These partners and stakeholders have expertise and capacity that Toronto can leverage as opposed to trying to do this alone, which we know would not be successful. And so it's for this reason we established that Community Benefits Advisory Group that its membership is on this slide here. And you'll see that it's a wide range of members, from those that are involved in the labor, government, as well as community and various parts of the city. Next slide, please. So I just want to touch briefly on some of the key challenges and opportunities. As I mentioned earlier, while there is a lot moving forward, the community benefits framework is still in its infancy at the City of Toronto. Part of the work for the next few years is to develop the back-end community benefits infrastructure that is needed to guide and support community benefit initiatives in Toronto. So this includes the need to develop the coordinated systems approach to local and social hiring pathways that connect employers with Indigenous, Black, and equity deserving communities. And Dina touched upon this as well, and this would be one of the places, actually the entire back end is one of the places where there is a cost to municipalities for us to be able to have staff that are dedicated to this work. So we need a systems approaches that includes players like job seekers, employment service agencies, training programs, skilled trade unions, and employers. And this level of coordination, convening, and planning required to make a seamless local and social hiring pathways that end up in opportunity on city projects cannot be underestimated. So to an earlier point that Dina made about what developers are willing to do and expect to do, clarity is important, and for them to be able to deliver on our expectations, particularly around local and social hiring pathways. They need a system that is seamless for them to be able to tap in, and this work is achievable. The city is working on it, but it is a messier ecosystem than I think we thought maybe back 3 years ago, for example. We also need to develop a evaluation framework that will guide community benefits initiatives on a systemic data collection, analysis on outcomes, impacts, and program implementation, so that we're continuously improving the work we're doing. We're keeping it accountable and evidence-based. And so monitoring and evaluation, I can't say enough about. Council endorsement is critical for this work in order for us to move and to have the right tools and the resources to ensure that this is one of the tools that we're using for inclusive economic development at the city. And as I noted, we've jumped ahead a little bit because the city in our most recent budget cycle actually agreed to dedicate a staff team, of which my colleague April Lim is the coordinator of, in order to ensure that we've got dedicated people doing this work, because it is not a side of the desk kind of work. We are literally building the car as we drive it. So we approach this work with a certain amount of humility. We're not experts. And this is why we need partnerships with community experts and with a range of city system players, so that we can really meet the value proposition that Dina spoke to. This work is critical, it's urgent, and can deliver impact. We just need to keep working through the complex operational details so that we can have the strongest tools and processes available to deliver the benefits that communities continue to want and expect from their municipality. So with that, I just want to thank you. We can follow up certainly with any details that may be helpful to you on your journey. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Denise. And I like your analogy there about driving the car as you're building it. So thanks very much for your trailblazing initiatives there at the City of Toronto. Are there any questions from my colleagues on committee? I don't have the full screen here. Maybe Tim, if you could take down the PowerPoint deck, that would be great. There we go. Okay. I don't see any questions, but Denise, how would you say how successful? Obviously, there's been some bumps along the way, but are you hiring the right targeted groups? Is it working? Are you more opportunities for people who wouldn't normally have those opportunities?
So I would certainly say that, so the social procurement part of this is our longest strand of this work, because we started there first. And I would say that through that and through Woodbine Casino, there are successes in hiring. There are successes with some of the community amenities. There are some successes with supplier diversity. However, at this point in the game, I would still say that we in Woodbine, we were too broad in our equity definition. And so what we discovered was that the broad definition was impeding our ability to go where we really wanted to go in terms of equity deserving groups and Black and Indigenous peoples. So we are fine tuning and targeting that better. I also think that in our social procurement, like in our supplier diversity work, we are, because we're 5 years in, we're doing a review of that work now, because I think we still have a clunky process and we still need to do more in terms of getting stronger on our monitoring and evaluation and compliance pieces. And then overall, back to that back end piece, we need to have a stronger, more seamless employment pathway in Toronto. There's a lot of actors in that space. And, more is not necessarily good. More is not necessarily seamless. Let me say that. More is not seamless. It needs to be coordinated. It needs to be stronger and tighter so that we can deliver the kinds of changes I think that both council and community want to see. So I think the short answer is that there's progress happening to say this is the right way for the city to move. We now are just investing the resources and have the structures in place to actually maximize, I think, and meet the value propositions that Dina spoke about. So it's in its infancy and we've got work to do, but we are on the right track.
Okay, great. Thanks, Denise. We had a question from Chair Redmond. Karen?
Thanks very much, Sean. And sorry, I don't know if you can see the whole matrix, but I did put my hand up. I have actually two questions for Denise or Dina. Feel free to answer. And Denise, really appreciate the fact that you're sort of new to this and you're ramping up. But one of my questions is, how is local defined and who defines it? And is there a dispute mechanism throughout this process for people who are unhappy with either the fact that they didn't get in or if they're subcontractors? I think those are the kinds of issues where the rubber hits the road.
You know, absolutely. And that I would say that early on in our social procurement, when we were focused on supply diversity at the beginning of this work in 2016, we were really struggling around what would international trade agreements mean around local hiring. To be very honest, that took a lot of time and energy with our legal staff and community to kind of work out. But local under our community benefits is defined differently for each project. So we're doing it on a project by project basis. In some cases, local means the city. In some cases, it means a certain geography. So in Woodbine, for example, there is a geography defined around the Woodbine casino itself in order to define that hiring. So part of our current work is about tightening the definitions, including local and social hiring. You know, that building the car. So one of the things that we've learned, again, is that we've been maybe a little too broad, maybe a little too fluid on some of these definitions. And now with greater other governments also participating in this work, there's opportunity for us to tighten those definitions. So I think we'll have more to come back to you and say to you, here's what it now looks like. But right now, project by project and maybe a little too broad.
I can just weigh in a little bit here to say that in the States, they often define local using postal codes because they find, particularly when they're trying to address poverty, that there are certain zip codes in states or postal codes here that where they are able to pretty clearly define the areas that they believe need the most support, and they'll use those as definitions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Councillor Harris.
Yes, thank you. Denise, just a quick question for you with regards to, staff resources. How much staff resources from the City of Toronto goes into community benefits?
So much of the, up until this year on community benefits, my colleague April Lim, so one of my staff, she's a policy development officer, or was the one person dedicated to this work. Obviously, she was talking to staff in other divisions, but it's not like any of those other divisions planning, had staff dedicated to community benefits. In this budget, Council gave us 6 positions to designate and create an office, if you will, of community benefits, so that so 6 staff are dedicated to this work specifically. And now they are continuing to work with all those partners and stakeholders that I talked about. So at this point, it's 6 FTE dedicated to advance that back end piece. And, do I think that that's enough? No, but I think it's a really good start, and it's a huge increase from where we were. And the office will allow us to actually be able to deepen this work. So I think we could probably move maybe not more faster, but certainly far more thoughtfully and effectively. And I think the opportunity that we have right now to evaluate the supplier diversity side, there is one dedicated staff on there. So if you add that, I guess we're at 7. And so we might be looking at adding more resources to our procurement division in order to support this work. But really our approach there has been, this is now just the way we do procurement. So it should just be embedded into procurement, and it doesn't necessarily need a number of people that are driving it.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Denise. Thanks, Dina. Our next presenter is Kim. Is it Buksa? Can I get that right? Kim from City of Vancouver. And if you're in Vancouver, Kim, it's pretty early there. It's 6:45 in the morning, and you've been hanging around for a while. So we're really pleased that you're here and that you're an early riser. So thanks very much for joining us today, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks very much for having me. I'm sure much of what I'm going to say is very similar to what you've heard from Dina and Denise. Just slightly different, of course, because you're never going to win the terminology battle. So I don't have control of the slides. I think your folks have control of the slides, although I could share a screen if need be.
We'll see what happens. Tim, do you have the slides there? We're loading the slides. I can't hear you, Tim. I think I hear something. There we go. Here it comes. Perfect.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. So I kept it really short and sweet. And similar to what you've heard from Denise, we have it split up in terms of social procurement, which is embedded into our supply chain. And then we're defining at the City of Vancouver community benefits agreements, which is actually housed in our social planning group. And they were sort of developed around the same time. So I like to put up this little graphic that I stole from some of our colleagues in the sectors to kind of, again, help frame what we're talking about and where those benefits are going. So again, if you want to go to the next slide, I can give some of the more details of the differences definitely for within the City of Vancouver. Looking at social procurement as something that is very much controlled internally to the city, whereas the CBAs, the community benefit agreements, are very much being applied onto developers. So these are not infrastructure pieces that the city owns. These are developer-owned properties and buildings. So the difference there, like I said, is really that level of control. But certainly it is essentially putting our social procurement onto those developers. So putting that onus on them to do the same thing that we're doing internally. Obviously, as mentioned, we do not have as much control. We have gone with the third party. That is what, in our scan of what other municipalities are doing, worked the best. And I'm sure, like many municipalities, we have very squeaky wheels in our community. And if they were not involved in those decisions and the monitoring, they would get squeakier, which we don't want. And so they're involved in that intermediary, allowing that third party to kind of really be neutral and really advocate for the transparency. And so we did go with that. And obviously they're closely linked to the community engagement groups, as well as the advisory group that we have within the city as well. And both of these were developed around the same time that I'll show on the next slides. And both came out similar to what Denise was saying, out of council direction through healthy city strategies. So both of these were put in there as part of the action plan and started having the same movement in the community. Social procurement, no surprise, within the city, moving a little bit quicker for many of the reasons that Denise just said. It's a little bit trickier and more convoluted for the CBA. And again, really the goals are quite similar, with some of the differences that were picked up on in terminology. For social procurement, we do not talk about local. Local is a no-go for us. But CBA, as mentioned, definitely, because it is in the private sector, they've kept that local component and wording in there. But we were again told from our legal to not make sure we're not having it in the social procurement side. But definitely that is the goal, and that is the workaround, right? For having local in there is that most social supplier diverse suppliers are typically local. And so if you want to go into the next slide. So this is our framework. Again, a little bit sort of the reverse of what Denise was saying for the City of Toronto. We have a framework for social procurement, but the CBA is actually a policy. But they sort of stand on this same foundation. And as was mentioned, it's very broad. As you can see, we define it very broadly. And the intent is definitely not to apply it that way, but that is the way that it was established so that it could stand the test of time and be a foundational framework or policy, and then be navigated within the priorities of the community and the council. So this is unlikely to change, although obviously the terminology, like I said, is always changing. But this will always be sort of the foundational framework. And the goal really is, as Denise mentioned, is to pinpoint which of these would be elevated either on a procurement by procurement basis, or the development by development base, or really what I tell other municipalities that are smaller or even private sector is to pick three, kind of have your preferred, which is, I would say, typically going to be Indigenous people or organizations serving Indigenous or disadvantaged folks, and then going into people of color, and then probably into gender diversity. And so if you're using those as kind of your top three and prioritizing them, then if you're not finding Indigenous businesses or businesses owned and operated or serving Indigenous people, then maybe you'll find people of color. And if not there, then maybe you'll find LGBTQ or women-owned businesses. So again, very broad with the goal that it's specific. And as you can see, it's really talking about supplier diversity, so diversifying the economic opportunities, as well as improving economic independence. And what we're seeing is, of course, no surprise, it shouldn't be a surprise, that when you're hiring from social diverse businesses, they typically, and now we have the data to back this, that they are also, of course, ahead of the game when providing economic well-being and workforce diversity within their organization. So we're definitely seeing that trend through the data that is being picked up. If you want to go to the next slide. And so just again, a little bit of the history on the social procurement. As was mentioned, we've sort of been dabbling in it softly for a little while. It was definitely formally launched in June of 2019, and that's through our executive leadership. And as I mentioned, it's not built into the procurement. We definitely have the wording in the procurement policy, and are constantly trying to get the policy updated, but we're having some difficulty through our legal channels. And that's not related to it being social, just simply a resourcing issue. But so knowing that it takes a significant amount of time to get policies updated at the City of Vancouver, we wanted to make sure that we were immediately implementing it in our templates and just in our process. So that is already happening. We ask questions on supplier diversity and employment equity on all procurements, and we will weight or evaluate those depending on the size and the type of procurement. As you can see, the challenges, of course, and this was touched on by Denise, is the responsing and the vetting, as well as, of course, the data capture and the evaluation. And you can see there that the city, the executive at the city set a lofty target of 50%, and that is the number of contracts as well as the value awarded. And we do tend to trend around 35%. And what's interesting, and this is the challenge that you'll hear me speak about in the CBA for the developers that we've heard, is that there is just simply a lack of opportunity in terms of lack of businesses that fit into that description. And so that is what we heard with our initial CBA. If you want to go into the next slide, that was the park resort. This is one of the challenges that came out of the first piloted, soft pilot, I would say, for the City of Vancouver, is that there were actually, as much as we have, like I said, many squeaky wheels and many community partners, and I'm sure you're all familiar, of course, Vancouver has a reputation for the downtown east side, and a plethora of people that are unable to access traditional employment or barriered from employment. With all of that, there is still not enough to actually fulfill the targets that were set out with the park resort. And so again, as much as you want to have that narrow kind of where are we really trying to do the most good, you have to remember that that's usually the smallest population as well, right? The most vulnerable, both in terms of number, but also in terms of access, right? Of their situation, that you are going to need those other. And that's what they found with Park, that as you're mentioning, they pinpointed local in terms of the area of where Park Resort is located in Vancouver. And of course, it nestles up against what is known as the downtown east side and Main Street. And that definition of local and who they were targeting for employment had to continue to be pushed out and expanded, because those folks were just simply not available or not in large enough numbers to meet the targets. And so that's something, and so that is the need for the intermediary. We hear all the time, our developers more than happy to, and we don't have the same workforce challenges, I would say, in Vancouver as there are in the Toronto area. But our developers are happy to work with us. The challenge is, of course, is that they don't know where to go. And the ones that they do know of, if those are maxed out or tapped out in terms of who and what they can provide, then they also, again, don't know where to go next. So that, again, really spoke to the need of having that intermediary. And that was something that worked really well with the Park Resort. So that was something that came out of that pilot. So as mentioned, it was standardized as a policy in 2018. You can see there that for this, again, it's external developments that are not owned by the city. All of those, of course, would fall into the social procurement requirements. This is a size-based, as you can see, 45,000 square feet is mandatory, and that is through the zoning process. So again, in terms of policy and who's monitoring it, that's in our planning process and the rezoning process. When this was first developed for 2018, as you can see there, they only could see forward to about 6 projects over the coming years. That may have increased a little bit now, but it's kind of that rolling number. It's like 1 a year is probably going to touch into that size. So again, once the pilot is done, with the one coming up for St. Paul's Hospital, this is the one that is starting to get off the ground right now, that obviously that will lead to additional learnings that'll be applied. And I suspect much of what Denise has mentioned will come up through that. You can see there through our legal, again, they were allowed to use local, although it's kind of downplayed. And so they did blow up kind of the best efforts of the targeted outcomes. So you can see there that it's could be any one or combination of those 3 things, whether it's the inclusive employment, the supplier diversity, or the local procurement. And it really is going to have to be that, because again, no surprise to you, there's not a lot of manufacturing happening in the city of Vancouver. There's not a lot of products being developed in the city of Vancouver. So local procurement is sure they might have headquarters here, which of course we see in our supplier diversity. But does that really, as you're saying, does that actually fit into the definition of what we're trying to achieve there for local procurement? And probably not. But you would be able to fairly easily hit the 10% for supplier, very easily. Obviously, as I said, we're doing 35. So again, developers would be able to hit that 10%, and the inclusive employment at 10% could be tricky depending on how it's defined. And I will just mention the fact as well that, of course, this is in line with the federal and the provincial infrastructure CBA, which is primarily targeted at employment and unionized employment. So again, for Vancouver and out here in the West Coast, there's not a gap in workforce, I would say, that exists in some of the other parts of the country. The employment piece is there, they are employed, but it's the equity piece. So sure, they're employed at the lower levels, but how are we moving them through their pathway of employment, right? Rather than keeping them at the lowest level. So that really is the focus, I would say, both for social procurement when we're talking about workforce or employee equity and diversity, is not just do you hit the numbers, do you hit your percentages within your organization, but where are they in the organization, and what are you doing to advance, as Denise was saying, to make sure that those opportunities to advance equity seeking and deserving are there, that they are deserving and being promoted, not just recruited. And the last slide is just the data on the social procurement. I thought you would find it interesting. Again, when I look at and hear sort of what the anticipated numbers are to come out of the CBA, out of one project, and at this point, I would say they're consuming more resources within both the City of Vancouver time in terms of our employee time, as well as external time. I'm not sure that they'll get the same value out of those dollars as we're seeing through our supplier diversity and social procurement. But obviously, we're working together, and it all moves the dial. And I think, as mentioned, then you then have the more data we have on this, which is definitely where I'm at in terms of having the 500 vendors and knowing who's doing what and which procurements they participate on and which ones they don't. It does allow us to fine tune and really dig into, as much as we can say 30% are social diverse. I'm more interested in the 60, 70% that are not social diverse, and what are they doing to up their game. And so that's us in a nutshell.
Well, great. Thanks very much, Kim. A decidedly different approach to this whole issue of community benefits, and social procurement is really the guidepost here for the city of Vancouver. I just one quick question. You know, when you have those targets, you listed them there in your second to last slide about 10% local employment and diversity. Is there any requirement for apprenticeship in those targets?
Yeah, there's not a specific requirement. So again, most of ours, that's not an issue. We've actually included the apprenticeship question into our tenders, so into our ITTs. And so it is a specific question and conversation there. And it does come up on a procurement by procurement basis with ours. If they're trade-based, then we do ask if they're incorporating apprenticeships. And then even within the apprentice, we're asking if it is apprentices for equity-seeking populations, IPOC populations. Okay. Yeah.
So you cover that through the contract, because, you know, when many of these initiatives were first introduced several years ago, the construction community got the employment piece, but the employment, unfortunately, for the diverse groups only lasted the length of the project, and they weren't indentured apprentices. And so once the project ended, their employment opportunity ended, and they were no really further ahead economically. So yeah, it's important to have that apprenticeship piece.
It is. And like I said, and that's why, like I was saying, for the employment equity piece, like you're saying, it's not just about having the numbers, it's asking where are those numbers and what are you doing to keep them long term. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay, great.
Yeah, and support them. Mm-hmm.
All right. Do any other questions from committee? Great. Well, thank you very much, Kim. Really appreciate that. Yeah, that's great. Keep up the good work there in Vancouver.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. Okay, Rosemarie Powell. Rosemarie, welcome. Toronto Community Benefits Network. There you are. Oh, you're on mute, Rosemarie. Yeah, I think you're connected now. Oh, no, yeah, maybe you need those headphones on. Sorry, still can't hear you, Rosemarie.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wonderful. In an abundance of caution, because my internet is being unstable, I decided I would go on phone. So that didn't work. So I'm back on internet. Hopefully this will work. But essentially what I'm saying is that I am loving this conversation this morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. And, you know, I love when I'm hearing Kim speak about the importance of community benefits and the employment opportunities really being about how do we ensure not just that you're getting a job out of this process, but that there's opportunities for advancement through the apprenticeship journey, becoming a Red Seal apprentice, a journeyman and a Red Seal apprentice at the end of the day. So you can take this career and trade wherever you go across Canada. I love when Dina talked about the hard targets and that contractors really want to make this crystal clear in the agreements that we sign off with them so they know what to deliver. They just want to deliver. And for Denise, you know, the city of Toronto is just doing phenomenal work in ensuring that there is a strong implementation process and a coordinated approach to make this community benefits work. So, you know, as an organization, really a community labor coalition, that has been, pushing the envelope for, over, since 2008, really, and building a community benefits movement. We're really pleased to see that this, this approach is being accepted more and as just a way of doing business. When we're looking at planning for a major infrastructure. I'm going to share my screen for my PowerPoint presentation and just take us through it. So just a minute, slideshow, and from the beginning. So this first slide really is some of our early days. Community benefits build on long established, community organizing work from across the city of Toronto in local neighborhoods. One of the first, push for community benefits agreements that we really like to highlight is the Rexdale Casino, because that is in, back in 2008 when this major development project was being planned. And the government decided that in a community like Rexdale, which is, one of the most racialized neighborhoods that has been recognized by the City of Toronto and United Way as what we call a priority community or a neighborhood improvement area, where we see, people who are dealing on a daily basis with struggles of the root causes of poverty. And to decide that they were going to put a casino smack dab in the middle of a community that was already dealing with these issues, community wanted to make sure that since the government has decided that they're going to do this, how do we ensure that in this development process that we're going to look at what are the benefits that could potentially come out of this for community? How will you reduce the harms that could possibly be caused by having a casino in a community that is already struggling? But even not just at the end of the day, the big, concept of having this, city within a city concept that was being proposed. But how can you ensure that while the project is being built, that people from the local community and people from equity-seeking groups, Black, racialized, and Indigenous peoples, who we know within the city of Toronto, especially in Ontario and Canada, has been dealing with issues of, poverty, high unemployment, lack of opportunities for the young people. How can we make sure that not that the community can benefit from it when the project is already built, but while it's being built, those, good jobs that comes from the construction industry, when you're talking about a $2 billion project, how do we maximize benefits for the community? The current planning process really is flawed because it doesn't look at, what happens now. It looks at what happens afterwards. So even though the Rexdale community back in 2008 were pushing for a community benefits agreements with their labor allies, and the project did not come to fruition, when another major opportunity came up through Metrolinx, back in 2013, the community decided that they would organize. And they brought partners together from across the city at the start. They had a big community meeting, talked about the issues, and they recognized that this $8.5 billion project was going to be running through 10 to 12 different neighborhood improvement areas along the Eglinton Avenue. And so how could community come together and really, make the case to Metrolinx and to our elected representatives that they needed to look at an intentional approach, community benefits, that would ensure that the jobs and opportunities that were being created on these projects would indeed also get extended to the community. What we also recognized very early is that the city of Toronto is quite diverse, with over 50% of the population being racialized. And when we looked at the construction industry, we also realized that there was a very low representation of this diversity, and we wanted to see that changed. So if you look at TCBN's history, 2013, we were formed as a legal entity that would be able to negotiate directly and have legal standing with Metrolinx. And we incorporated in March 2014, and we moved from a 13-member organization to becoming a 120-member organizations made up of social enterprises, community organizations, and labor organizations and groups who had their own constituencies. Right now, we have a really strong movement in our nation of over 10,000 supporters that we're able to engage with and to help, raise, the perception or the issues within the public's eye. And so our organization is, we incorporated as a not-for-profit. Our values are built on equity, diversity, and inclusive development, really at its core. When we talk about community benefits, that is what we mean. And we do focus on supporting those who have been historically underrepresented in the labor market, but especially in the construction industry, and who has been especially ignored, especially when it comes to the planning process. So we look at how do we ensure that Black, Indigenous, and racialized people's voices are centered in the decision-making process? How do we create additional supports and programs to facilitate youth, women, and newcomers from these communities to be able to participate in a system that is oftentimes very opaque and complex and not welcoming? And our goal is just to advocate for those for community benefits agreements and to ensure that there's oversight by community throughout the life cycle of the project. We want to see community benefits being discussed, like Dina has said, before the infrastructure project is built, way early in the planning process. Right now, we're participating in the Downsview, secondary plan conversations, for example, because there's going to be a massive redevelopment there. And we know that it's, we're early in the conversations, but as community, we want to be a part of the process. We want to make sure that there's good jobs and economic opportunities that are going to be achieved through the investment in infrastructure and urban developments. And we usually look at 4 main areas when we negotiate for a community benefits agreements. We want to see construction apprenticeships while the project is being built. Professional, administrative, and technical jobs, because not everybody wants to or can be a construction worker. And of course, there's operational jobs that comes after the project is being built as well, because we want to look at the entire life cycle of the project, social procurement, and of course, there's been environmental improvements that we want to see from that. We know that in City of Toronto, in Ontario, in Canada, there is over, just in Canada alone, 187 billion of infrastructure spending that has been designated. The provincial government is matching that, in the cities. Municipalities are also doing that. And here are some of the major ones that you can see that are coming up within the next 10 years or currently undergoing. And as you can see, for TCBN, we started out with the Eglinton Crosstown project as being our first community benefits agreement with Metrolinx. And that's a $12 billion project. And, we understand that the City of Toronto would like to be the sole signatory on community benefits agreement, but we believe the community still needs to be centered in the process. On the Eglinton Crosstown project and the Metrolinx projects, and of course, the West Park Healthcare Center, which is another project that TCBN is now signatory to, that we're supporting, the community is a signatory, and it doesn't impact on the Metrolinx's ability to enforce its contract with the general contractor. Why we know that community benefits agreements are beneficial. So when we hear the construction industry initially pushing back against it, it was really difficult for us to hear that, especially when at the same time, the same industry was saying that their major concern right now, this is the Ontario Construction Secretariat's report that shows that in Ontario, the most pressing issue for the construction industry right now, for their members, is recruiting skilled workers, because we know that there's going to be massive retirements that is happening. And this industry has significantly left out the experience of, Black and racialized peoples and Indigenous peoples within their ranks. And we're better to recruit, to fill that skilled shortage that they will have in the next 10 years. And especially as we're recovering from COVID, it's not as easy anymore to just import people from other countries to be able to do the work. So we do have to look locally. We do have to look at, those people who have been excluded from the industry to be that, the pool of talent that the industry will draw. This is another, some stats from the Ontario Construction Secretariat's report. And there's a lot of there. And of course, we're sharing the PowerPoint presentations with everyone, so you can look at it at your leisure. But what I wanted to pull out is on the right, the cultural diversity piece, where you see that the industry has said from their own statistics that across Ontario, there is 11% of visible minorities that work in the unionized construction industry. And in Toronto, 22% of visible minorities that work in the unionized construction workforce. So when we're talking about targets for our community labor coalition, it begs the question, before we found out this stats, because this is pretty recent, when we were getting into this back in 2014, when we were negotiating with Metrolinx, we asked for a 10% commitment for equity-seeking groups. And we were told that this is, really, forward thinking, I guess, and, difficult to do. And, how can we possibly get there? But here's an industry that's saying that they're at 22%. They need to be at 50% to reflect the diversity of the community. But if we're asking for a 10% commitment, for us, that should literally be the floor. Dina has already gone through some of the outcomes from the Eglinton Crosstown project, the Finch West LRT project, Casino Woodbine. She had shared the information about the West Park Healthcare Centre being one of those projects that was identified by the Government of Ontario as a pilot. It's a smaller project. As you can see, it's a $1.2 billion healthcare center redevelopment project, and it's in early days. So there's not a lot of outcomes that we can share right now, but there are 9 placements that, that we can account for people from the Black and racialized communities that had an opportunity specifically because of the community benefits on the project. And we'll continue to monitor the development of the West Park Healthcare Centre. What I really like about what they have done differently is that when they got started, in 2018, we had our first meeting, and they brought everybody to the table. They brought the unions, they brought the contractors, they brought the community, they brought all the stakeholders, and really hashed out, how are we going to do this? And made it very clear that this was going to be a requirement for the project. And that kind of intentionality is so important. And that's why we're pretty confident that this too will succeed. We also have a community benefits pilot with York University, who, they didn't have a requirement for a community benefits agreement because of the Bill 6 Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act of the Government of Ontario, or the City of Toronto's Community Benefits Framework. It's something that they decided that as a university that is an anchor institution within the Jane and Finch community and other neighborhood improvement areas, in the surrounding area, they wanted to do their part. And so they initiated a conversation with the TCBN, and we worked with them to develop a social procurement policy, and they were able to come up with their own community benefits pilot. So we want to see leadership from the city. We want to see leadership from our elected officials. But we also want to see the industry themselves take up the responsibility for saying, you know what, this is the way how we do business. We're pretty pleased, of course, with the City of Toronto's new community benefits framework in 2019 that was adopted. And then we were able to get a 10% commitment cemented just this year in February, early February. And we're going to be going back to the city again in Q2 2022 to make the case that we want to see this 10% to be the floor, and we want to see it as a hard target. And we think that the city is well underway to being able to do that. TCBN, one of the things that is very important to us as a community labor coalition, especially with the fact that 50% of our board is labor, construction labor, and 50% community, we wanted to be a part of the solution. And so one of the things that we've decided that we will take responsibility for is working with our community pre-apprenticeship service providers and employment services providers to really coordinate a process, a system that will be intentionally working to identify people who are a good fit for the industry and support them through very intentional processes and provide wraparound supports that they need in order to prepare them to get into the construction industry, which you might know can be very, very demanding and unwelcoming. In 2020, you might have heard about nooses found on construction sites, telling Black workers that they're not welcome there, that they're not safe. And so these are the issues that we're trying to address together, and standing with the industry, standing with labor, community will be a part of the solution to help address these very pressing issues. And one of the programs that we're most excited about is our mentoring program, the Next Gen Builders Mentoring Program, which is a community, labor, and industry partnership to really provide that one-on-one support and guidance and coaching from an experienced mentor, from an experienced journey person or construction career professional who will basically help to handwalk that individual as they come into the industry and to support them at least through the first year of their apprenticeships and through their career, because we know we've identified what we call the U-turn. People get in, but they don't tend to stay because of the challenges that are in the industry. And they don't have a brother, an uncle, a father who is going to, help them to navigate. And so what we're finding is that the construction industry partners that we're working with are really taking it up in terms of their responsibility and the support that they could provide to be a mentor to these young people. And not just young people, women, Indigenous, racialized adults, who are, looking for a way, a hand up, not a handout. And we offer the Quick Start in Construction Apprenticeship Readiness Program. We provide training and supports through our partner, the Labor Education Center, who does the delivery of the training. But we wanted to make sure that we're filling gaps that we've identified within the ecosystem. Oftentimes, apprenticeship programs or pre-apprenticeship programs, there are certain artificial eligibility criteria that you have to meet. You got to be on Ontario Works, or you got to be on unemployment insurance, or you got to be out of work. So this is a flexible program that happens in the evenings and on weekends, or for a month straight, just to help people to be able to transition. And we provide the certificates the basic certificates that they will need, and the preparation to be able to do the union intake into the construction apprenticeship. This is our Next Gen Builders Mentoring Program. it's a full training for both the mentors and the mentees. And during COVID, we ramped up the program, and we've had about 588 people who's passed through the program so far. We have our Next Gen Builders Mentoring retreat that is coming up on August 28th, and we're going to be having about 100 people over in the Niagara on the lake, just, building rapport with each other, connecting with their mentors, and we have industry partners who are going to be coming and doing some motivational speaking and just kind of, just building that support system around them so that they know that when they're in the industry, they have all the support that they need to succeed. That's it for my presentation to you. Any questions?
Well, thanks very much, Rosemarie. Questions? Yes, Councillor Harris.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm not sure if the other presenters are still online, but if not, perhaps you'll be able to answer. I'm interested in how you folks are tracking long-term outcomes with the groups that are hired as a result of community benefits program. Perhaps you can speak to how is this being tracked, and secondly, how are you determining what the success looks like?
Thank you for the question. So as part of the community benefits agreement with Metrolinx and with Infrastructure Ontario for the West Park Healthcare Centre, one of the basic systems that we have in place is a community benefits working group, which brings together all the stakeholders around the table. We meet quarterly, and the tracking and the onus is on the general contractor to provide us with the information for the people that they've hired and their status with the company. So that's how we're able to share those numbers with you. What we also do is we have what we call proxies. It's just a term that we use. So pre-apprenticeship service providers that are funded through the Ministry of Labour, Training and Skills Development, or the City of Toronto, to provide pre-apprenticeship training to people from these underrepresented communities. And so we prepared the list of the organizations who, many of them are members of the Toronto Community Benefits Network. And what happens is that when the contractor or the union hires through these pathways or through these proxies, the community organization, just through their own tracking responsibilities to the government for their funded programs, are able to tell the people who are hired through those pathways are actually qualified to be community benefits candidates. And we have more to do in terms of, looking at how we have a more coordinated tracking system, not just on a project by project basis, but for the entire community benefits program, whether it be citywide or Ontario-wide. There's more work to be done there.
April, you'd like to add to that response?
Thank you. Yes. So at the City of Toronto, as Denise had mentioned, we are building out a monitoring and evaluation framework. It's a key component of that back-end implementation infrastructure that we're building as part of the community benefits framework. And Councillor Harris, that monitoring and evaluation framework, or M&E framework, is exactly where we will be articulating what are the outcomes, what are the impacts, short-term and long-term, that need to be measured on a project-by-project basis in order to validate the achievements of the hard targets and the goals that are set out in each community benefits project. So I think you're getting at a really key component. How do you measure the success of the projects and of the implementation of those community benefits clauses that you put into contracts? And that's something that we do not expect the contractors or the employers to come up with on their own. We see this as something that the City of Toronto has to work with the employers on developing those outcomes, those impacts, the tools and the protocols and the resources to do the tracking, so that we have a consistent and a coordinated approach to monitoring and evaluation across all of the City of Toronto's different projects and initiatives, so that at the end of a year, we can collectively report across all of our community benefits projects to tell the story of a collective impact, not just of one project, but across all of them. So we need to make sure they're collecting the same type of data in terms of outcomes and so on.
Okay,
and
great.
I just wanted to add that this work we're doing, we've created an ad hoc working group as part of our community benefits advisory group to do this work together with all of our stakeholders. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, April. Does that answer your question, Councillor Harris? Yeah, okay, great. So I just recognize we have like a minute left, and Rosemarie and all our presenters this morning, thank you very much for all of that information and the great work that you do, and that's really informed our process here at the Region of Waterloo. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to Richard this morning, our own Region of Waterloo staff, to give us an update on some of the work that has occurred at the Region of Waterloo around community benefits, particularly in our housing portfolio. But I would invite Richard to come back, Mr. Dyer, to the next meeting. And I think that makes good sense that we have this, we can digest this, the PowerPoints will be made available. We can review it, and then we'll have our own staff lead off the next meeting, and then we can get into a discussion, I would suggest, on what the next steps would be in terms of any kind of recommendations coming out of this committee to council. How does that sound in terms of process, Mr. Dyer?
I think that sounds just fine, Chair Strickland. We'll arrange for the internal staff team to get together over the next week or two and look to put some material together in order to facilitate that conversation at the committee's next meeting. Thank you.
Okay, great. Excellent. So again, it was very informative. I learned a lot this morning. I'm sure we all did. So thanks everyone for your patience, and we'll call the the next meeting. We'll work through and we'll survey the members of the committee and find out what we're going to have the next meeting. And so, seeing there's no other business, I'll have a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Harris, second by Councillor Galloway. All those in favor, just signify by raising your hand. That's carried. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. All right, take care. Bye.